Hi everyone, my name's Nic Weststrate. I'm a recent PhD grad from the University of Toronto. My supervisor is Michelle Ferrari, who you likely know from here or other areas in which his writing on the topic of wisdom. I'm here. It feels great to be here, by the way. It feels really great to be here, so thank you again for the invitation to talk and share a little slice of the research that I've been doing, which hopefully will stimulate discussion and provoke some thought. I'm talking about the best, worst day of my life. Lucky for you, it's not my life. That's only for my therapist. But I will be talking about some people's best, worst days. The reason I chose this quote is because it's emblematic of how a lot of people think about life events from which they develop wisdom. These are difficult life events that they've somehow redeemed or grown from in some way. And we're going to look at that a little bit more closely in the next 10 minutes or so. So by way of background, and this is really just setting up the argument or where I come in currently to the wisdom world, it's really about this topic of life experience. When you ask people how people develop wisdom, they typically say life experience, but of course this is very non-specific, and that's never really satisfied me, so I wanted to probe that further. So as I've said, lay people and experts both believe that wisdom develops through life experiences. I'm focusing on naturally occurring life experiences as opposed to those that are sought out and pursued over long periods of time, such as professional specialization, educational training, which might also facilitate wisdom development. Of course, not everyone with life experience is wise. In fact, many of them are sad, bitter, or possibly unaffected entirely by their life events, and not to imply that sadness and wisdom can't happen at the same time either. The question I ask then is, what supports growth in wisdom from this type of experience? What are the psychological mechanisms in this case, but also social mechanisms and so on? Across models, researchers have pointed to the role of self-reflection in wisdom development. So that's what my research has focused on. These are the guiding research questions of my emerging research program. What type of life experience and how much of it is associated with possibly the development of wisdom or associated with wisdom? How are different components of self-reflection related to wisdom? And does this self-reflection moderate the association between life experience and wisdom? So I'll present on some of these findings now. I'll be talking about data collected through in 3 different data sets, one lifespan sample, one emerging adult, and one midlife adult. In all of my studies, I collect people's autobiographical memories. I'm a narrative psychologist. I've tried as much as I could to collect multiple measures of wisdom, as well as questionnaire instruments that gauge self-reflection, as well as narrative coding approaches to measuring self-reflective processing. I've also collected a life event checklist, which I'll talk about, and to get at the question of life experience, as well as I've asked people to provide a wisdom-fostering event memory. So looking back on their life, this is an event that they recall developing wisdom from, and then we've coded those for the types of events reported. Looking at the quantitative life event checklist, what we see is, I should first say something about the life events. These were all largely momentous, significant life events taken from existing inventories, existing checklists. I've then decomposed those life events into different characteristics by having naive judges rate every event for their fundamentality. So how important is it to human functioning versus how inconsequential or trivial. You'll see here that we only have fundamental life events, and that's an artifact of the checklists themselves. There were no trivial events really on these checklists. Emotional valence, we looked at how emotionally positive or negative the events were, and also, and I think really interestingly, how culturally normative or non-normative they were. And that refers to whether or not someone would expect to experience a particular life event over the course of their life. And what we see here is that regardless really of how we decompose these events, there is a curvilinear relationship between the number of events experienced and wisdom. And these are inverted U-shaped curves. Also interestingly, and possibly counter to a lot of our folk beliefs, is that we see strong relationships, consistent relationships between the number of positive life events experienced and wisdom. So there's something to be explored there. I think there are a couple explanations for why we see that, which we might get into later in the discussion, and one of those being different than the explanations for why a negative or an adverse event might lead to the development of wisdom. So I think that's really interesting territory, theorizing about why positive and negative events might lead to wisdom in different ways. The wisdom fostering event memories that I talked about, I then had expert coders rate those for fundamentality, cultural normativity, and emotional valence. So they were trained on definitions of what those were and then rated 482 wisdom fostering events. What we found was that on average, wisdom fostering events were fundamental, they were somewhat culturally non-normative, and emotionally negative. So at least in people's minds, this is the prototypical wisdom fostering event, which would align with that sadder but wiser idea, the idea of growth through adversity. When we looked at the event types reported, largely these were relationship events and mortality events. So the frequencies are listed on the right here. Though of those events, we saw things like divorce, interpersonal conflict, death, premature death, untimely death, illness, and these conform to that prototypical event, fundamental, culturally non-normative, and emotionally negative. But we also saw other events as well that people grew from. Birth narratives were really common. Becoming a parent, so that was not really common, but the most common positive type of event. And other more trivial things like recreation, and as we'll see in a moment, a fishing trip with a dad can, for some people, lead to wisdom. This is a long narrative, but I think I'm going to read through it really quickly, and you read faster than I talk, so I'll be a little bit quick. I think it's really important that we read these memories or hear them. This is why I'm a psychologist. I love people's stories, and I've learned so much from them. This memory really epitomizes the subjective theories of wisdom development that people shared with me. And it's from a 46-year-old woman from New York. She was 22 years old when this event happened, and I'll warn you, it's a difficult narrative to read. It was the best, worst day of my life. You see now where I got that. And this was reported in writing, I should say. Laying on the shower floor, bewildered, finding safety in the solitude as warm water rained over me. My fiancé had come home after work. Things had been rocky for months, and he was increasingly more critical and controlling of everything I did. But expectations were mounting. Parents expected a wedding. There were wifely duties to be fulfilled, and I was failing at most turns. The cooking wasn't good enough. The apartment had to be spotless. There was no room for error. Frank arrived in a foul mood. We were meant to go out for a romantic evening. It was anything but. He answered the welcoming kiss by throwing me to the floor and assaulting me. In the horror of that moment, I woke up to the reality of who he truly was. The man I fell in love with was a fiction, an illusion of who he wanted to be. Who I wanted him to be was shattered. The reality of him sneering insults with his knee grinding into my back and the carpet burning my face was an angry bully, petty, small. I managed to wriggle free, pulled my knees to my chest, sitting up like a fortified stone. I quietly growled, "You'll never touch me again." He left and I sat there alone, still hugging my knees against my naked chest as the afternoon light gave way to dusk and darkness. Eventually, I crawled into the shower, sobbing, finding solace in the warm water and steam that caressed and soothed. For months, he had criticized relentlessly and tried to break my spirit. He peeled me like a rose and found nothing there. That night, he tried to break me physically. Ironically, in his effort to destroy me, he made me stronger. In trying to make me more submissive, I became more independent. In that moment, I found me. So to this participant, this was the moment where she gained wisdom. And this, again, embodies many of the narratives that were shared with me. This event is atypical. It's a very trivial event that's possibly a little bit emotionally positive or mixed, not fundamental to life. But I love this narrative so much. It's my favorite. 50-year-old man from Kansas, 12 years old at the time of the event. The day I gained wisdom is very clear to me, a very short episode that stuck with me for years and years. My dad and I were fishing at the river without luck. We were there forever, it seemed. We had some really good poles and we were casting them out to good spots. There were no bites. After we had been there for a bit, this little older black lady climbed the dike and walked down all the giant rocks to the riverbank and started fishing next to us. She asked how the fishing was, and my dad was like, "No good today." She had a bamboo pole with a very short line. She started fishing only about 5 or 6 feet from shore, and I'll be damned if she didn't start pulling in catfish right and left while my dad and I were fishing with no luck whatsoever, even with our fancy poles. My dad asked her at one point how in the heck she was having so much luck and we weren't. Her answer has stuck in my head for years. She said, "If you want to catch a fish, you have to know where to put the pole." Even then I knew that was deep. I felt I was going to be unstoppable. I'm not sure if I can say we became better fishermen from that, but that phrase has echoed in my head and helped me make more than one decision in my life. It is a litmus test for choosing what, where, and when to make important moves. So you see from this event that some people can derive wisdom or construct wisdom from atypical experiences or trivial events, not very adverse. So it speaks to something about the person who's reflecting, the ability to perhaps read deeply and abstract from a life experience and then apply to similar or different situations in the future. So while I'm very interested in understanding the life experiences that might facilitate wisdom development, I'm also interested in these psychological processes or person characteristics that might support its development. And for that, I've looked at self-reflection. And what I've found using scale measures is that across measures of wisdom, wisdom is positively associated with the frequency of behavioral engagement in self-reflection, so how much people reflect. I have a little star here because this has been a mixed finding actually in my studies. One of my studies showed that there was no relationship between how much a person self-reflects and wisdom, which actually is to be expected because it's not about quantity of self-reflection, it's about the quality and how people go about self-reflecting. Also, wisdom is positively associated with the motivational need to reflect on the self. It's associated with self-perceived insight gained through self-reflection, and also with productive modes of self-reflection. And this is a dispositional or trait measure of productive self-reflection. I wanted to probe this further, though, in the narratives that I had collected. And I was very early on influenced by Ursula's work on self-reflection, and because it resonated with my undergraduate training, which was in narrative psychology. And I knew from my narrative framework that there was a way to operationalize some of the things that she was saying. And she had said that wise reflection is one part remembering or reminiscing on the self, and doing that well, high quality reminiscence, and also analyzing the past for further significance or deeper meaning. This is characteristic of how wise people look on the past. And as I said, taking an autobiographical memory approach, I could look at the quality of remembering by scoring narrative coherence, using a multidimensional measure of coherence. I could also look at the quality of narrative processing or analysis by looking at two different self-reflective processing modes. One, I measured exploratory processing, and the other, redemptive processing. People who explore their life experiences, they don't just describe what happened in the event. They really go into what the event has meant for the self. They report lessons and insights that vary in their development or complexity. People who engage in redemptive processing, their goal is to typically take an event and transform it emotionally from a negative to a positive and seek resolution or closure. And I predicted that these two processing modes would relate differentially to wisdom. What we found in turning point memories and wisdom fostering event memories was that, yes, narrative coherence was positively associated with wisdom, but exploratory processing predicted incremental variance above and beyond narrative coherence. So they are engaging in high quality remembering, but also that further analysis. In difficult and stressful life events, we found that exploratory processing was positively related to wisdom, as expected, and redemptive processing was positively related to adjustment. We found that these were uncorrelated processes, but I don't think they're orthogonal. I think Ursula will talk about this later, that developmentally there's a developmental time matters, and that at this point they were uncorrelated. But it's possible that this sort of adjustment-like response toward redemption creates an amount of well-being needed to then engage in a deeper, thoughtful, contemplative process, or not. There's something going on there. Here, combining the study, the measure of our life event checklist with self-reflection, these are both questionnaire measures, and I have other interaction graphs as well, but I wanted to present this one here. Here we're looking at trait wisdom as the outcome. Individuals who experienced a high number of negative life events and engaged in high-quality self-reflection had the highest levels of wisdom. Those who had a high number of negative life events and engaged in low-quality self-reflection had the lowest levels of wisdom. So there is an interaction between life experience and how people self-reflect. Looking at that within narratives, we see that quality of self-reflection varies as a function of the characteristics of the event being told. So narratives of events that were emotionally negative and culturally non-normative typically were more coherent than others and involved deeper levels of meaning making. Could be that those types of events pull for that analytical processing. And if that's the case, then we see a contribution of the situation or the environment in terms of pulling for types of processing that might ultimately lead to wisdom. So I say here discussion themes and outlook. Outlook because these represent some of the directions, future directions of my research, but also are things that I would like to discuss or have been thinking about quite a bit, have been discussing. People have asked me, is self-reflection an antecedent, correlate, or defining characteristic of wisdom? There's something to be unpacked there. Can exploratory processing be trained? Will such training influence wisdom over time? To what extent is exploratory processing dispositionally and or situationally determined? Looking at intra-individual variability in exploratory processing across events, multiple events in one's life story. The role of rumination in wisdom development. I think this is really interesting, and post-traumatic growth researchers have something to say about this. I think that wise people use rumination judiciously to explore the past. There probably is a period of rumination early on that allows them to get in touch with their own emotions, explore negative emotion. Exploratory processing is hard work. There's no question about it. And finally, what is the content of these lessons and insights that wise people have derived through exploratory processing? What is it that wise people know about life that others don't? And that's really exciting to me. So that's actually something that I'll be pursuing next. So thank you for your attention. I would like to acknowledge the people who have been mentors of mine or collaborators on these projects. I'm totally humbled to be here, and I appreciate any feedback or comments you have.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that presentation. So just a comment and a question. So the comment is that you should look at Anne-Marie Rupke's work on post-aesthetic growth. So she has a couple of papers looking at people reporting changes after positive events. So that would be really relevant to some of your findings. So one question I had about your narrative prompt is, to what extent do you think people would report negative events in response to your prompt because they feel a culturally mandated compulsion to do so, right? So to what extent do you, it could well be that for many of these people, they reported the certain events because they felt those events were important to them. But I could also imagine some people felt, typically adversity makes you stronger, let me think about the worst thing that happened, and let me then spin a story about how it made me stronger. It's possible that some of that might have happened. I'm just wondering, is there a way in which you could control for that in a design?
Well, I think that the fact that the prototypical wisdom fostering event was fundamental, negative, and non-normative could be an artifact of stereotypes about wisdom development. That's why it was important that I had an objective measure of life experience as well. So this was a subjective approach, looking at the implicit theories of wisdom development, and that's why I really wanted to include that questionnaire. And when we look at the questionnaire data, experiencing many positive life events does in fact associate positively with wisdom. So I think that that in a way is not controlling for it, but it's a bit of a triangulation approach, exploring it in using different methods. So I mean, I've thought about how I would do this study again or possible future approaches. I'm going to ask for more narratives. So it could be that the front of mind memory that they have is there because it's been activated by some sort of a stereotype. But if I ask them to present 10 memories they have of wisdom development, I might be able to get at some of those more positive experiences or have a greater representation or sample from an individual life course.
Yeah. So one question.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you for a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
How important are the events really? I mean, one could argue that self-reflecting people would have become wiser no matter what. And the event is just coincidental. They remember it because it is objective, emotionally violent, and that's fine. But really, would one say that they could not have become wise if they didn't have the event?
I mean, that is a great question, and many of us may have different perspectives on that. I don't know the answer empirically. My hunch is that, yeah, there is this huge sort of like dispositional piece where there just are meaning makers out there, growers, people who are growth-oriented, and that give them whatever raw material to work with, they're going to extract or derive some lesson from it. I'm not as interested in those people, I guess. I'm more interested in the people who aren't dispositional growers, or however you want to call it, but the people who actually might take a more adjustment-oriented approach to life, who then have some sort of a, catalytic event or something like that happen that they then interpret in this wisdom-promoting way. So I don't know yet, but that is a direction of research I'd like to pursue.
Hi, thank you for the talk, Nic. I was interested in this last point about the content. What is it actually that these people are eventually finding out? And it might sound a bit glib, but if you could find out what it is they're finding out, yeah. Would that process of going through everything else be sort of unnecessary? Or do you think you still have to go through that process?
No, so I'm just going to find out what every wise person knows, publish a book, and then nobody has to explore their life and their life experiences.
Exactly.
It's going to be like a 101 things that wise people know. Well, I think, of course, it matters that they need to process it themselves. It's about internalization. Growing up, my parents told me to do lots of things, and I didn't do it, right? We don't just listen to these external, forces or sources of information and advice. Sometimes we need to learn through experience. So I think, I have a lot of trouble with the self-help industry, right? Moralizing and telling people what to do and how to feel and how to think. So I wouldn't want, that's not where I'd want to be in my research or the outcome of my research. And I think that to get real buy-in, people need to go through a valuing process. They need to go through an internalization process, and that requires an emotional connection to the lesson or the insight, I think, and context. The lesson has to fit within their life and the circumstances of their life, therefore need to be amenable to that lesson, and it's a personal process, I think. Ursula?
Well, if I may, I would just like to maybe add to your response that I just think it's worthwhile to understand where wisdom comes from as much as it is to understand what wisdom is. And I see what Nic is trying to do is to unfold some of the pathways. And so I find that really exciting, and I really would like to congratulate you how you combine, the methodology from a narrative approach with some of the more quantitative approach. I think it's very beautifully done. I just felt inspired by this finding about the positive events. And I was wondering whether some of this seeming question that it raises in our thinking is linked with this label. That you gave an example that, of course, having your first child or having a child becoming a parent is an inherently positive event. Who else, some might not call it that, but most of us would. And it tells you something that it's sort of like a eudaimonically positive event, not a hedonically positive event. And so I would be curious to my prediction is when you look more closely at these positive events, there's a majority of eudaimonically positive events which carry in themselves a challenge, an inherent challenge that really puts yourself at stake, your self-concept at stake, that makes you reach your limits, that makes you, in all its positivity. So anyway, I just thought that was really a very fascinating finding. And my second small point is the method you have been using is great. Mm-hmm. I just highlight for you that it is suggestive. In which way is it suggestive? You are asking about individual events, and that is stipulating, I would call it the enlightenment pathway of wisdom, which may be one, and coming back to Dilip's question, there's the shepherd on the meadow who doesn't experience anything except watching his sheep and maybe a wolf coming and trying to eat one of his sheep. And nevertheless, we have this conception that such a person without many events can come to wisdom, which is another pathway of wisdom. And so it seems that we are not all shepherds, right? We are embedded in life, and we have to deal with the day-to-day vicissitudes. And so could there be also a method that allows recalling or reconstructing aggregates of events, so that it's not so much that you get enlightened by one flashbulb experience, but by actually the repetition of things, and then at a point, either because it's so hurtful because you have done the same mistake now 10 times, that you have no way but to realize something is going on here. So I was just wondering about that.
That's great. I'll be brief because I know we're out of time, but I like that idea that when you were saying that, I was thinking a theme, right? A narrative theme, and narratives have themes, and lives have themes, and if we assume that lives or accept that lives are stories, certainly there's a theme. But we don't need to get into all of that to know that multiple similar events can happen over a life course, and you're absolutely right. Maybe there's sort of like some point where you have to have that moment of reconciliation. That was really helpful, thank you. I'm going to look into that and think about that some more. And about the positive piece, you're also absolutely right. When you read the narratives, many of the positive events involve disruption. And I think that positive life events can be quite disillusioning in a way, actually. And like disillusionment, we often think about as being a very negative thing. But I think what that really means is just that we have are introduced to a new understanding of life. Our expectations of life have been shattered, and we need to revisit those. And in this sort of constructivist Piagetian way, we are led to new knowledge structures that are wiser. So I think calling things positive and negative, I'm not going to do that anymore. It's now about disruptiveness or something of that nature. And the last thing I'll say is that another characteristic of positive life events is awe. Sometimes when you have a birth or something like that, people have this transcendent experience of awe. One birth narrative talked about the awesome responsibility of parenting. And I didn't ever make the connection before that awesome, like the word awe was connected to that. Like here I am just like, cool, awesome, right? This is about a real psychological experience. So I'll leave it there. Anyway, thank you.